In the early 1940s, American families were asked to do something most people today would find almost unthinkable: grow food, not for enjoyment, not for trend, but because it mattered. There were no garden centers filled with choices, no shelves of quick fixes, and for many households, the soil they had was the soil they had to make work. And yet, something surprising happened. Those wartime gardens didn't collapse under pressure. They didn't demand constant attention. Season by season, the soil became easier to manage, not harder. Harvests grew steadier. Effort slowly went down instead of up. Here's the part most people were never told. Those results didn't vanish because the methods failed. They vanished because once the war ended, remembering them was no longer considered necessary. If you've ever felt that gardening today asks too much, more money, more strength, more fixing, you're not imagining it. This is where that feeling starts to make sense. Before we go further, if this kind of calm, practical remembering speaks to you, consider subscribing to Golden Garden Days. We're here to preserve the kind of garden wisdom that doesn't rush and doesn't wear you down. And if food growing was part of your family's past, share that memory in the comments. You're not alone in this. In a moment, we'll begin a countdown. 6 soil secrets used during World War II that helped ordinary families grow more by doing less. And we're starting with the one that asks you to stop working so hard. Secret number 6. Leaving life where it falls. The wartime necessity. During World War II, gardens weren't judged by how tidy they appeared from the fence line. They were judged by one thing only: whether they could keep producing food week after week, with fewer hands and fewer resources. Fuel was rationed, time was scarce, bodies were tired, gardeners could not afford extra steps that didn't directly serve the soil. So a quiet rule emerged, not from theory, but from necessity. When a plant finished its season, it stayed where it had grown. Stalks were cut close to the ground. Leaves were allowed to fall and settle. Roots were left in place to loosen slowly, creating space underground long after the harvest ended. This wasn't carelessness, it was efficiency, refined by pressure. Wartime gardening pamphlets explained it plainly. Soil life works best when it's fed what it already recognizes. The tiny organisms surrounding a plant's roots, the bacteria, fungi, and unseen helpers, adapt themselves to that plant over the season. When everything is pulled out and removed, that system is broken apart. When it's left in place, the soil completes its own work without interruption. Decades later, soil science would put names to these processes. Surface organic matter reduces evaporation. Decomposing roots improve structure. Underground life builds sponge-like soil that holds both air and water. But families in the 1940s didn't need explanations. They saw the results with their eyes. Each year, the soil became darker, softer, easier to work. Crops struggled less. Water went further. Yields stayed steady even when conditions were poor. There was another reason this practice mattered deeply, and it still does. Leaving life where it falls spared the gardener's body. No arm loads to carry, no repeated bending, no dragging piles across the yard. One clean cut at the base of the plant. And the work was done for the day. Over time, these gardens asked less from the people tending them. The soil stayed cooler in heat. Moisture lingered longer after rain. The ground lost its hardness and took on a gentle give underfoot. Gardening became something that fit into life, rather than something that drained it. If you've ever walked through a forest and noticed how quiet and forgiving the earth feels beneath your shoes, that softness didn't come from maintenance. It came from patience, from years of leaves, stems, and roots being allowed to return exactly where they belonged. Victory Gardens learned that lesson quickly because they had no choice, and it's a lesson worth keeping now. So when a plant reaches the end of its season, pause before clearing it away. Cut it low, leave it where it stands. Let the soil finish what it started. This wasn't a forgotten trick or a clever shortcut. It was a wartime necessity, and it still works today because the soil never stopped remembering how to take care of itself. Secret number 5, finish borrowing life from healthy places. During the war years, gardeners didn't talk about revitalizing soil, they talked about waking it up. In the early 1940s, many families were handed plots of land that had been overworked, compacted, or simply neglected. There was no time, money, or access to manufactured solutions. Yet those gardens had to produce. Failure wasn't an option. So people turned to something older and far more reliable than products: living soil that already knew how to function. They understood a simple truth: soil isn't created by mixing ingredients. It's built by relationships between microbes, roots, moisture, and time. And if those relationships were missing, they could be reintroduced. Garden guides from the WWII era quietly recommended taking small amounts of soil from healthy, undisturbed places: wooded edges, old hedgerows, the ground beneath long-standing trees, not because it was better dirt, but because it was alive. That soil carried bacteria, fungi, and microscopic life that had been cooperating for years. When brought into a struggling garden bed, those organisms didn't stay small. They multiplied. Research decades later confirmed what those gardeners observed firsthand. In healthy conditions, soil bacteria reproduce rapidly, and fungal networks expand outward, linking new ground to existing life. A small introduction doesn't remain small for long. It spreads, organizes, and restores balance, without instruction. What matters here, especially for gardeners who've lived long enough to know restraint is wisdom, is how this was done. It was never about taking much. A few careful handfuls from a thriving place, never stripping, never disturbing fragile ground. The goal wasn't extraction, it was sharing, borrowing life, then letting it return home through growth. For seniors today, this carries reassurance. If your soil looks tired or unresponsive, it doesn't mean you've missed your chance. It means the living system needs a reminder of how it works. Once that reminder is present, it continues on its own. No lifting heavy bags, no complicated schedules, no constant intervention. Those wartime gardens didn't succeed because people worked harder. They succeeded because people worked with what was already proven to endure. Living soil was trusted to do what it had always done: rebuild itself when given the chance. And that's the quiet wonder of this secret. The soil doesn't need to be manufactured back to health. It needs to be reintroduced to life. When that happens, the garden doesn't rush, it steadies itself, just like the people who once depended on it. Secret number 4. Plants are stronger together. During the war years, gardens were not planted for beauty or order. They were planted for reliability. Seeds were limited, space was limited, mistakes were costly. So gardeners paid close attention to what helped plants succeed with the least waste. And one pattern became impossible to ignore. Plants grew better when they were not alone. Victory gardeners noticed that certain crops seemed to protect each other. Some shaded the soil, others improved it, some discouraged pests simply by being nearby. These observations weren't new discoveries. They were reminders of much older knowledge that had already proven itself long before the 1940s. Indigenous farming communities had practiced intercropping for centuries, long before it had a name. They understood that plants, like people, function best in relationship. Tall crops offered support. Low-growing plants protected the ground. Others replenished what their neighbors used. The garden became a system instead of a collection of individuals. During World War II, this way of planting returned out of necessity. Row after row of single crops required more water, more attention, and more correction. Mixed plantings, on the other hand, were steadier. When one crop struggled, another carried on. When weather turned harsh, the soil beneath remained protected. Cooperation reduced risk. Modern agricultural research would later confirm what gardeners already knew from experience. Polyculture systems, where multiple crops grow together, consistently show better soil health, improved resilience, and more stable yields than isolated plantings. Roots occupy different depths. Nutrients are shared rather than exhausted. Problems spread less easily. But beyond productivity, there was something else happening, something quieter. Gardens planted this way required less control, less fixing, less worry. And for gardeners whose bodies were already carrying years of work, That mattered. There's a human truth here that many seniors recognize immediately. Life becomes more manageable when support is shared. When one person slows, another helps. When one struggles, the group adjusts. Gardens planted in companionship behave the same way. They don't demand perfection. They compensate. If you've ever noticed that certain plants seem calmer, growing side by side, you're not imagining it. They are responding to balance, and balance is easier to maintain than force. Let's pause here for just a moment. If this way of thinking feels familiar, if it reminds you of how things used to be done or how communities once worked together, you're exactly who this video is for. You're welcome to subscribe to Golden Garden Days if you'd like to keep exploring this quieter kind of garden wisdom with us. And if you remember planting different crops close together, or watching parents or neighbors do it without calling it anything special, share that memory in the comments. Those experiences carry more knowledge than most books ever could. Now, let's keep going, because the next secret looks beneath the surface, to the helpers we never see, but depend on every single day. Secret number 3, feeding the unseen helpers. Long before gardeners had names for bacteria or charts explaining soil systems, they noticed something simple. Some soil could almost be trusted, while other soil needed constant attention. The difference wasn't effort, it was life. In the 1940s, when growing food became a national responsibility, gardeners were forced to pay attention to what actually made plants strong. There were no quick remedies to fall back on. When crops struggled, the answer couldn't be sprayed or sprinkled on top. It had to come from below. They began to understand that the real workforce of the garden was invisible. Beneath every healthy plant lives a vast unseen community. Bacteria breaking down old material into usable food. Fungi extending thread-like networks that move water and nutrients where roots can't reach. Tiny organisms occupying space around roots, quietly blocking disease before it can take hold. None of this could be seen, but all of it could be felt in the way plants grew, steadier, tougher, more balanced. Wartime garden guides didn't talk about overpowering problems. They spoke about supporting the soil itself. The belief was clear. When the underground life is cared for, plants require less correction above ground. Leaves stay healthier, roots grow deeper, failures become less frequent. One common practice at the time was the use of simple biological brews, what we might now call compost or soil teas. These mixtures weren't meant to force growth. They were meant to spread living organisms into tired soil, giving that invisible workforce a chance to re-establish itself. Gardeners applied them gently, trusting that once life was present, it would organize its own balance. Modern soil research later confirmed these observations. Living soils regulate nutrients naturally. They improve structure. They hold moisture longer, and once established, they protect plants without constant interference. But families in the 1940s didn't need scientific language, they needed reliability, and this delivered it. There's also a deeper shift here, one that matters especially with age. Feeding the unseen helpers changes how gardening feels. It moves you away from constant control and towards stewardship. Instead of reacting to problems week after week, you build conditions that prevent those problems from appearing in the first place. That approach brings calm. It replaces effort with patience. It allows the garden to carry more of the responsibility itself. Much like strong communities, soil thrives when every member, even the smallest, is allowed to contribute quietly. These organisms don't ask for recognition, they ask for consistency, organic matter, moisture, time. During the war years, gardeners learned to respect that invisible labor because success depended on it, and that respect paid them back with steadier harvests and fewer struggles. When you feed the unseen helpers in your soil, you're not complicating the garden, you're simplifying it. You're choosing cooperation over control and letting the hardest work be done where you don't have to see it. Secret number 2, never leaving soil exposed. One of the quietest lessons learned during the war years had nothing to do with planting dates or crop choices. It came from noticing what happened when soil was left bare. In gardens that struggled, the ground hardened quickly. Moisture vanished faster than expected. Weeds appeared aggressively, as if the soil itself were trying to protect something. Gardeners began to realize that uncovered soil behaved like skin without clothing, vulnerable, stressed, and easily damaged. So they stopped leaving it exposed. During World War II, winter wasn't a pause from responsibility. Soil still needed care, even when nothing edible was growing. Gardeners learned that living roots were not just for harvest, they were guardians. When something remained growing, even briefly or quietly, the soil stayed alive. Wartime gardening guides advised planting cover crops whenever beds would otherwise sit empty. These weren't crops meant for the table. They were crops meant for protection. Their roots held soil in place during heavy rains. Their leaves softened wind and cold. Beneath the surface, those roots fed the underground life that would otherwise fade during dormant months. Modern research later confirmed what those gardeners observed by necessity. Covered soil retains moisture far longer than bare ground. Living roots reduce erosion and compaction. They maintain soil structure and keep beneficial organisms active even when temperatures drop. When spring arrives, soil that was protected doesn't need to be repaired. It's already ready. But beyond the science, there was a deeper reason this practice mattered. Covering soil was an act of care. It acknowledged that rest doesn't mean abandonment, that pauses still require protection, that life continues even when it's not visible. For gardeners who had already learned to pace themselves through long lives, this felt natural. You don't leave something you value exposed to the elements and expect it to thrive. There was also a practical benefit that mattered greatly to tired bodies. Soil that stayed covered remained softer, easier to work, less demanding when the next season began. Instead of starting from scratch each year, gardeners were picking up where they left off, and the work itself was gentle. Scatter seed. Let growth happen. When spring arrived, plants were cut down and left in place, returning everything they gathered back to the soil. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. If you've ever noticed how nature never leaves ground uncovered, how fields, forests, and even roadsides always find something to grow, you've already seen this principle at work. Bare soil is an emergency state. Living soil is a protected one. Victory Gardens learned this quickly because they couldn't afford erosion, loss, or recovery time. Every season mattered. Every bed had to remain ready. So when a garden bed finishes producing, don't think of it as empty. Think of it as resting and deserving of care. Give it cover. Give it roots. Let it stay protected until it's time to grow again. This wasn't about maximizing yield. It was about preserving what made growing possible in the first place. Secret number 1. Seeds that remember you. When food became uncertain during World War II, people began to think differently about seeds. They were no longer just something you planted and replaced. Seeds became memory, proof that what worked this year could be carried into the next. Gardeners noticed something important. Seeds saved from plants that survived local weather, poor soil, or neglect didn't behave the same as seeds bought from elsewhere. When planted again, they emerged stronger, steadier, more familiar with the land they were returning to. Without using scientific language, people understood what was happening. The garden was learning. Every season, seeds quietly adapted. They adjusted to late frosts, dry spells, heavy rains, pests unique to that place. The strongest plants passed those lessons forward. Over time, gardens became better suited to their exact location. Not because someone engineered them, but because someone paid attention. During the war, seed saving wasn't framed as nostalgia or tradition. It was practical insurance. Store shelves were unreliable. Deliveries were uncertain. But a small jar of dried seeds meant continuity. It meant the garden didn't have to start from scratch every year. It could pick up where it left off. Modern plant research now confirms what those gardeners observed. Plants adapt genetically to local conditions over generations. Seeds saved from resilient plants carry traits that improve survival in the same environment. This process doesn't happen overnight, but it compounds quietly, year after year, as long as someone keeps saving. There's also something deeply human about this practice. Saving seeds changes how you see your garden. You're no longer just growing for the present moment. You're shaping what comes next. Each season becomes part of a longer conversation, and between the soil, the climate, and the person tending it, gardening slows down. It gains meaning beyond harvest. For seniors especially, this carries weight. It reframes gardening as contribution, not effort. You're not just maintaining a plot. You're passing along knowledge encoded in living form. Seeds saved today may be planted by someone else tomorrow, a child, a neighbor, a future gardener who never met you but benefits from your care. During the war years, families understood this instinctively. Seeds were shared between households, labeled by hand, stored carefully in cool, dry places. They weren't commodities, they were commitments. When you save seeds from your strongest plants, you're doing more than preparing for next season. You're allowing the garden to remember you, your patience, your climate, your way of working gently with the land. And long after the harvest is finished, that memory continues growing. That is why this is the final secret, because it doesn't end with you. It carries your presence forward, quietly, into seasons you may never see. And that may be the most powerful kind of gardening there is. After the war ended, life changed quickly. People were tired. They wanted ease, certainty, and relief from years of strain. And in many ways, that was understandable. The country shifted its attention from survival to convenience, from making do to moving fast. At the same time, entire industries were looking for new purpose. Factories that once produced wartime materials were retooled for agriculture. What had been built for urgency was now redirected toward abundance. Fertilizers, pesticides, and packaged seeds promised consistency and speed. They offered results without waiting, without watching, without learning soil slowly. None of this required bad intentions. It was simply the direction systems take when scale becomes the goal. The problem was subtle. Knowledge that had been shared freely, from neighbor to neighbor, parent to child, didn't fit well into this new model. Methods that made gardeners independent didn't create long-term customers. Skills that improved soil year after year reduced the need for repeat purchases. And wisdom that worked quietly without packaging had no place on a shelf. So it wasn't erased overnight. It was replaced. Instruction manuals became product guides. Local seed jars gave way to catalogs. Feeding the soil turned into feeding schedules. Gardening shifted from a relationship into a transaction. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, people were taught to depend on inputs rather than observation. The methods themselves never stopped working. They just stopped being passed along. That's important to understand, not with frustration, but with clarity. This wasn't about tricking gardeners. It was about what systems reward. Dependence scales. Independence doesn't. And knowledge that can't be patented often fades unless someone chooses to carry it forward. That's where you come in. There's no need to change everything at once. In fact, that would miss the point entirely. This week, choose just one gentle action. Leave plant material where it falls. Save a few seeds from a plant that did well. Cover a patch of soil that would otherwise sit bare. Or simply spend a moment noticing how your garden responds when you stop correcting it. No checklist, no pressure, no performance. Gardening doesn't need to be impressive to be meaningful. It needs to feel like companionship, something that fits into your life instead of competing with it. One small act is enough to begin remembering. Golden Garden Days exists for this reason, not to chase trends, not to promise perfection, but to keep hold of knowledge that was never meant to disappear. Gardening can still be quiet, it can still be steady, it can still offer peace instead of demand. Every time you choose patience over force, observation over products, care over control, you're continuing something older than any industry, a way of working with the land that values continuity over speed. Thank you for spending this time here, for listening, for remembering. Until next time, keep your hands in the soil, your pace unhurried, and your days golden.